Before superhero movies dominated pop culture and the box office, and long before the cinematic universe became Hollywood's formula of choice, comic book movies were still trying to find their footing. That uncertainty created space for experimentation. Instead of polished, studio-driven blockbusters, audiences were met with strange, genre-blending films that felt raw and unconventional. From the mid-90s to the early 2000s, there was a unique wave of comic book movies that were dark, stylish, and steeped in horror. They followed leather-clad anti-heroes across dystopian cityscapes, set to pounding alternative and industrial soundtracks, reflecting the current cultural sensibilities of the era. These movies weren't always good, but they were distinctive, ambitious, and unlike anything the genre has produced since. This was the Gothic age of superhero movies. The Gothic age of superhero films refers to a period in which the superhero genre fused horror aesthetics, industrial and grunge culture, and the disillusionment of post-Reagan America into a distinct visual style and emotional language. These films were defined by their tragic anti-heroes, decaying urban landscapes, and soundtracks rooted in alternative subcultures. The era began with Tim Burton's Batman, peaked with The Crow and Blade, and fades by 2005 with the rise of gritty realism in Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. This framework positions the Gothic Age as a formative subgenre in comic book cinema, one that defined the genre's early experimentation before the rise of modern superhero storytelling. This era of superhero storytelling can be traced back to several cultural and cinematic shifts, but its true beginnings lie in a transformation within the comic book industry. By the mid-1980s, as readers matured, they demanded stories that reflected their own complexity and cynicism. Writers like Frank Miller and Alan Moore responded with landmark works such as The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, Watchmen, and The Killing Joke. These stories stripped away the innocence of previous decades, reimagining superheroes not as untouchable icons, but as morally fractured figures. These stories questioned the very idea of masked vigilantes claiming to serve society. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for a darker, more serious vision of the superhero myth. In 1989, Tim Burton brought these sensibilities to the big screen with his film Batman. It was the first time general audiences were exposed to a darker, gothic interpretation of the character. Before then, most people still associated Batman with the campy Adam West TV series of the 1960s. The film made a massive cultural impact. Batman became the highest-grossing film of that year, grossing over $250 million. It proved to studio executives that darker superhero films could not only succeed, but also dominate the mainstream. And as studios tend to do, they immediately tried to recapture its success. The following year, Sam Raimi's Darkman was released. Despite being an original character, it fit perfectly within this new atmosphere. Raimi leaned fully into horror influences, borrowing heavily from the Universal monster films of the 1930s and 40s, especially Frankenstein and The Invisible Man. Darkman bridged the gap between horror and heroism. The film was pulpy, mythic, and grotesque all at once. It was stylized, melodramatic, and infused with Raimi's signature mix of sincerity and chaos. More on Sam Raimi later. Burton's Batman proved that audiences were ready for darker, moodier visions of their heroes. But that shift was not happening in isolation. It reflected a broader cultural rejection of the glossy excess that defined the 1980s. In 1991, that rejection exploded in the music industry when Nirvana released Nevermind, an album that shattered the glam rock dominance of the decade before. Almost overnight, the teased hair and neon lights of the 80s gave way to grunge's stripped-down authenticity, flannel shirts, raspy vocals, and lyrics steeped in disillusionment. The album's impact was seismic. Nevermind even knocked Michael Jackson, the king of pop himself, from the top of the Billboard charts. In its wake, Seattle bands like Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden surged into the mainstream, cementing grunge as the defining sound of a new generation. The film industry felt a similar shift. The result was a wave of what would later be called 90s cool. Films built around leather-clad anti-heroes, dystopian cityscapes dripping with cynicism, and soundtracks pulsing with alt-rock, techno, and industrial music. These films didn't just look darker, they felt darker, mirroring the angst and alienation of Generation X. These films would borrow heavily from Asian influences. Hong Kong cinema introduced ballistic gung fu through filmmakers like John Woo. Japanese anime delivered surreal dystopias with films like Akira and Ghost in the Shell. And of course, classic martial arts films of the 70s and 80s shaped the physicality and fight choreography of American films of the time. All of these threads culminated at the end of the decade with The Matrix, the ultimate expression of 90s cool, a film that fused cyberpunk philosophy, Hong Kong wirework, anime visuals, and a techno-industrial soundtrack. This created a cultural phenomenon that redefined what action and superhero-adjacent cinema could be. Life of Slice has an excellent breakdown on 90s cool, which was the main inspiration behind this video. I will leave a link in the description to his video. I would highly recommend checking it out. While The Matrix marked the high point of 90s cool, another film would release 5 years earlier that captured the same spirit in a darker, more tragic form, a film that would define the Gothic age itself. The Crow was the first true entry of the Gothic age of superhero movies. It felt like the culmination of Burton's Batman and the rise of grunge and alternative culture, fusing those two influences into one singular vision. The film's Gothic aesthetic clearly owed a debt to Burton, but it carried a raw, punk-infused edge, both stylistically and musically. The soundtrack in particular was a perfect match for the film's bleak atmosphere, and remains one of the most iconic of the era, featuring bands like The Cure, Stone Temple Pilots, Rage Against the Machine, and Pantera. It wasn't just background music, but an extension of the film's identity. In many ways, the soundtrack captured the spirit of the 90s alternative scene, as much as the visuals captured the Gothic age on screen. I can't talk about this film without talking about Brandon Lee. As I mentioned earlier, many films of this era drew heavily from Asian influences, and Brandon Lee, son of legendary martial arts actor Bruce Lee, embodied that lineage. He had found some moderate successes overseas, starring in martial arts films, but The Crow was set to be his breakout role in Hollywood, a film that could have launched him into superstar. Tragically, that promise was cut short. On March 31st, 1993, while filming a scene, Lee would be struck by a faulty prop round. He would pass away due to his injuries. He was just 28 years old. Instead of The Crow launching Brandon Lee into superstardom, it would become his final performance, a film forever marked, by the loss of its lead. Lee's death elevated The Crow to mythic status. In the wake of the tragedy, film circles would debate whether it was ethical or not to release the film, while others would draw comparisons to his father, Bruce Lee, who was another star that was taken from us way too soon. The tragedy behind The Crow runs deeper than the film itself. James O'Barr created the comic as a way to process the death of his fiancée, pouring his grief into a story of love, death, and vengeance. Years later, Brandon Lee's death on set added another layer of heartbreak to the adaptation, forever binding the film to real-world loss. Perhaps that's why The Crow resonated so deeply. Because behind its Gothic style and grunge soundtrack, it was a story born from tragedy and marked by it. In many ways, The Crow stands as the cultural and emotional centerpiece of the Gothic age of superhero movies. A work born from tragedy, defined by tragedy, and remembered for how it fused grief, style, and music into something unforgettable. While The Crow showed what Gothic superhero films could be at its artistic peak, Hollywood's biggest superhero franchise was about to be steered in a completely different direction. Despite the fact that Tim Burton's Batman Returns was a success critically and financially, the film would be controversial among parent groups. McDonald's even pulled its Happy Meal tie-in, citing the film's dark violence and overtly sexual themes as inappropriate for children. The executives at Warner Brothers panicked, as they tend to do. Burton was pushed out of the director's chair for the third film and replaced by Joel Schumacher. With that change came a drastic tonal shift. Instead of continuing the dark and gothic aesthetic of the Burton films, the studio pivoted toward a brighter, campier, and most importantly, more toy-friendly direction. Batman Forever was a box office hit, but its critical reception was mixed. Many die-hard fans saw it as a step in the wrong direction, a betrayal of the darker, more ambitious tone that Burton had established just a few years earlier. The sequel, Batman and Robin, doubled down even further on this approach. By most accounts, the film was designed first and foremost as a vehicle to sell toys, with the script and production around merchandising opportunities. The result was a movie that felt less like the continuation of Batman's Gothic reinvention and more like a glorified toy commercial.
That's why every Poison Ivy action figure comes complete with him!
The film was universally panned by both critics and fans for its childish tone, awful script, and baffling casting choices. What Burton had redefined as a dark, brooding figure just a few years earlier was now reduced to a man in a rubber suit with nipples on it, sliding off the tails of dinosaur statues and attending dating auctions in costume. It feels surreal saying this out loud, and that this was approved for a Batman movie. Batman and Robin effectively put the franchise on ice. Sorry for that. For the next 8 years, until Christopher Nolan would reboot the franchise with Batman Begins. But we'll get to that later. That same year, 1997, Spawn made its way to the big screen. Unlike Batman and Robin, which buried itself in neon camp, Spawn embraced the darker, horror-tinged aesthetic that defined the Gothic age. Based on Todd McFarlane's popular Image Comics series, the film followed Al Simmons, a murdered soldier who makes a deal with the devil and returns as a Hellspawn anti-hero, a premise dripping in Gothic and supernatural potential. Even though the film didn't stick the landing, weighed down by abysmal CGI that looks ripped straight from a PS1 game, along with thin characters and a weak script, it carried the trend forward of horror-driven Gothic superheroes. Spawn leaned into the macabre imagery of hell, demons, and twisted anti-heroes, keeping alive the darker sensibilities that mainstream franchises like Batman were abandoning at the time. This film also holds a very special place in comic book movie history. While still technically released earlier in that same summer, we don't talk about that movie, Spawn was the first major comic book movie to feature a black superhero lead, with Michael Jai White in the title role. That distinction, along with its willingness to embrace horror-infused visuals, made it a notable milestone, even though its execution fell short ahead of its ambition. Released in 1998, Blade was everything Schumacher's Batman wasn't: sleek, violent, and unapologetically cool. It was a superhero movie, wrapped in the skin of a horror action flick, where the hero wasn't a shining symbol of justice, but a half-vampire, daywalker, who hunted monsters by the night. The tone was set perfectly from the very first scene, the infamous vampire rave, drenched in blood and strobe lights, scored by a pounding techno score. It felt like a transmission from another world, the perfect marriage of 90s club culture and comic book mythology. The film would also use bullet time, a year before The Matrix would be released, strangely making this film ahead of its time in that aspect. Wesley Snipes brought effortless charisma and physical presence into the role, crafting one of the most distinctive anti-heroes of the decade. His performance was pure confidence, equal parts stoic and swaggering, a perfect reflection of the film's industrial edge. Blade proved that darker genre-blending comic book movies could still be successful, commercially and in the pop culture, grossing over $130 million worldwide on a modest budget. It was the first true Marvel movie that was successful, years before the company became a Hollywood juggernaut. Without Blade, there would likely be no X-Men, no Spider-Man, and ultimately no MCU. 2 years later, Bryan Singer's X-Men was released, the transitional film between the dark stylistic 90s era to the modern blockbuster model that would soon dominate Hollywood. It definitely did borrow from the cultural sensibilities of the time, with its now widely mocked all-leather costumes, but it stripped away the horror elements that defined their earlier films, such as The Crow and Blade. X-Men was a critical and financial success, marking the beginning of the end for the Gothic age of superhero movies. Then, the following year, one September morning would change the world and the nation forever. 9/11 transformed nearly every aspect of American life, including the stories audiences wanted to see on screen. Almost overnight, the appetite for morally ambiguous anti-heroes vanished in the face of real-world evil. Audiences no longer wanted tortured figures fighting their inner demons. They wanted heroes that could protect them from evil. What the world craved was reassurance, clear-cut heroes, clear-cut villains, and the comforting belief that good could triumph over darkness. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man arrived at exactly the right time. It was a film defined by optimism, bright, hopeful, and heartfelt. In the wake of 9/11, when America was reeling from tragedy, Spider-Man felt like a source of hope. A story of an ordinary young man rising up to become a hero and protecting his city from an undeniable evil. The film's tone struck a delicate balance, with camp and sincerity. It was colorful and fun, yet it treated its characters and its audience with respect. Director Sam Raimi, best known for the Evil Dead trilogy and the before-mentioned Darkman, even infused the film with flashes of horror DNA. Green Goblin's transformation scene plays like a demonic possession from a supernatural thriller. Raimi doubled down on that horror sensibility in the sequel. The infamous hospital sequence in Spider-Man 2 plays like a full-blown horror short, smuggled into a summer blockbuster. From the buzzing chainsaw, a nod to Evil Dead 2, to the chaotic camera work, to the haunting image of a woman being dragged across the floor, clawing her nails into the tile. For many kids watching this in 2004, this was the first time a superhero movie really scared them. Raimi's first two Spider-Man movies became the blueprint for the next 2 decades of comic book movie cinema. This was the true beginning of the golden age of superhero films, a period that would stretch all the way to 2019 with the release of Avengers Endgame. But traces of the Gothic age lingered for a few more years, in films like Blade 2, Daredevil, Hellboy, and Constantine, each carrying fragments of the darker DNA into the new millennium. Despite of the larger tone shift happening in superhero cinema at the time, horror-infused comic book movies didn't disappear entirely. They made a brief return starting with Blade 2, directed by Guillermo del Toro. The film leaned more heavily into action than its predecessor, but it still carried a distinct gothic edge. Del Toro infused it with grotesque creature designs, pulpy atmosphere, and bursts of gory horror imagery that set it apart from brighter, crowd-pleasing hits like Spider-Man. Daredevil would follow the next year, and while it didn't lean into the horror sensibilities the way Blade 2 did, it absolutely oozed with that late 90s, early 2000s sensibilities. From its glossy red leather costume to its angsty nu metal infused soundtrack, it felt like a time capsule of the era. The soundtrack famously featured Evanescence's Bring Me to Life, which is easily the most remembered aspect of this film in pop culture. Del Toro would return just 2 years later with Hellboy, a film that blended pulp adventure with gothic horror. It mixed demons, monsters, and Lovecraftian mythology with the tone of an Indiana Jones-style adventure. While less tragic and brooding than either the Blade movies or The Crow, its DNA was still pure Gothic age, stylish, creature-driven, and steeped in supernatural atmosphere. Constantine would arrive the following year, diving headfirst into religious horror, a sharp contrast from the mythic fantasy of Hellboy. Where Hellboy explored monsters and myth, Constantine was steeped in Catholic guilt, exorcisms, and damnation, and at the center of that was Keanu Reeves, the definitive face of 90s cool. From Point Break to The Matrix, Reeves had embodied the sleek, stoic, anti-hero archetype for over a decade, and seeing him as a chain-smoking demon hunter felt like the perfect spiritual endpoint to that era. None of these movies were big box office hits, but they have developed a devoted cult following over the years that followed. They stood out for their distinct artistic visions, with Guillermo del Toro emerging as the era's defining creative voice through works like Blade 2 and Hellboy. Still, this brief resurgence of horror-driven superhero films wouldn't last very long. The Gothic age was fading, giving way to a new era defined by gritty realism and soon after, the rise of the cinematic universe that would reshape the genre entirely. The Batman franchise found its long overdue renewal with Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Tonally, the film echoed many of the Gothic Age's hallmarks. The shadows, the moral ambiguity, the brooding hero, but traded the supernatural for something entirely new. Grounded realism. The film didn't just revive Batman, it reshaped cinema as a whole. Suddenly, every other movie studio wanted its own dark and gritty reboot. The Gothic age of superhero movies didn't fully die overnight, but Batman Begins represented the final nail in the coffin. So much of that earlier era had been tied to the cultural sensibilities of the time, the angst, the industrial sound, and the grunge-soaked worldview. By the mid-2000s, that tone had almost entirely vanished. The subgenre had briefly evolved, with traces of post-grunge, new metal, and early 2000s emo music. But as pop culture shifted towards slicker, more polished aesthetics, these darker, weirder films began to feel like a relic of another time. The Gothic age was all but over at this point. Not with a crash, but with a fade into realism. By the late 2000s, the Gothic age was all but gone, but not entirely forgotten just yet. In its final embers flickered a handful of strange, tonally confused holdouts. Ghost Rider was one of them, a film that feels both oddly of its time and oddly out of step with it. Visually, it's drenched with the loud oranges and blues of the early 2000s blockbusters, but tonally, it's pure 90s camp. The villain looks like he auditioned for the part of Edward Cullen in Twilight and is still bitter about the fact that he didn't get it. The dialogue borders on absurd, and then there's Nicolas Cage doing his thing, which is entertaining in its own ironic way. Beneath it all, you can still see the ghost of the Gothic age trying to burn through. Whereas Burton's Batman once redefined darkness with Gothic Art Deco and atmosphere, Ghost Rider had reduced it to CGI fire and lame quips. 2008 would be the most formative year of the comic book movie genre, because of the release of two monumental films that would redefine the genre forever. Christopher Nolan's follow-up to Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, didn't just raise the bar, it entirely rewrote the rules. It was a crime epic, disguised as a superhero film, blending moral philosophy with blockbuster spectacle. Heath Ledger's Joker instantly became legendary, because of his Oscar-winning performance and his untimely death, immortalizing the film much like Brandon Lee's legacy had once haunted The Crow. And just a few months earlier, another film would quietly begin a different kind of revolution. Iron Man didn't only revitalize Robert Downey Jr.'s career, it ignited the most successful franchise in cinematic history, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. With that, the Gothic age was officially over. The age of the anti-hero, of the industrial soundtracks and shadow-soaked cities, gave way to the age of shared universes, post-credit scenes, and billion-dollar synergy. A few stragglers would follow, Hellboy 2 and Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance, but by then the world had already moved on. The Gothic age was over, its remnants scattered across sequels that felt more like echoes than evolutions. Now, since the golden age of comic book movies has all but faded, traces of the Gothic age are beginning to re-emerge through nostalgia and experimentation. A couple years back, a Blade reboot was announced, with Mahershala Ali as the lead, though this film has been in development hell for many years now and is unlikely to happen. Wesley Snipes made a brief return as Blade in Deadpool and Wolverine, a film that played out as a love letter to the early 2000s era of comic book movies. Yet, the character himself returned, the sensibilities that once defined his world did not. Snipes' cameo was clearly designed to tap into our nostalgia, and even though it lacked the grit and attitude of his original films, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't excited to see him again. Sam Raimi's return to the superhero genre came with Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, a film marketed as Marvel's first venture into the horror genre. Raimi's unmistakable style shone through in flashes, from kinetic camera work to moments of gleeful campy terror, yet the movie felt torn between two worlds, a director-driven nightmare from one of the genre's great visionaries, to an overproduced, studio-controlled MCU cameo fest. The Crow also received a reboot last year, with Bill Skarsgård stepping into the role of Eric Draven. Remaking the original story and doing virtually nothing new with it felt like sacrilege. The film was panned by both critics and audiences, and it bombed at the box office. The film's failure proved that the Gothic age of superhero movies was inseparable from the culture that birthed it. These stories weren't just dark for the sake of aesthetics. They reflected the mood and texture of their time, and some stories, especially ones born from real-world grief like The Crow, simply don't belong to any other era. A Clayface movie is rumored to be in development, rumored to be an R-rated body horror film in the vein of The Substance. While little is known about the project so far, it seems poised to tap into the same ideas of the Gothic age, exploring transformation, tragedy, and the monstrous side of humanity. The film will likely mirror Todd Phillips' Joker, being a psychological thriller at its core, but with strange horror elements to tell a tragic story of a man consumed by his own inner demons, and allowing that to turn him into a monster. It's the kind of premise that could reintroduce the intimacy and darkness the superhero genre has largely abandoned. Let's just hope Warner Brothers resists the urge to rush out a hollow sequel if it succeeds. Let's hope they learn their lesson from Joker Folie à Deux. The Gothic age of superhero movies was a strange and often forgotten pocket of the superhero genre, but as the audience grows tired of the same old MCU formula, there has been a renewed appreciation for these earlier experiments. Many of these films weren't perfect. Some were messy, uneven, or outright flawed, but through nostalgia and a longing for something truly unique, they've found a new life among fans who crave the unconventional. Yes, these films were definitely products of their time, but that's what makes rewatching them today so fascinating. These were time capsules from a darker, more experimental era of comic book cinema, and through modern projects like the upcoming Clayface film and The Batman, which borrowed heavily from the 90s classic Seven, the DNA of this era still lingers today. The Gothic age of superhero movies may be long gone, but its shadow still haunts the genre. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to give this video a like. And if you want more content like this, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell notification so you can be notified every time I upload a new video. And shout out to Wikipedia and Corbin Blue. Thanks for watching.